Acts chapter 23 this evening. Acts chapter 23, beginning at verse 12 and moving down just to verse 35. So Acts chapter 23, beginning at verse 12. I can give you just a little background to remind you kind of where we are. Paul has been returned to Jerusalem. He's brought with him a gift to give to those who are suffering in poverty in the churches there, as well as perhaps the broader people of the Jews. And yet, when he gets there, he's not welcomed at all. He's seen as a Gentile friend to the Gentiles, and that is appalling to the Jews, and they try to arrest him. And yet, the Roman legion that's there actually at the temple rescue him and pull him aside. And yet, this is what we read in verse 12. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who had made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." And the tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they're ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called the two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. When I came upon them and the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. And on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. This is an ongoing story of the difficulties Paul has in his life of trying to take the message of the gospel out into the world, and now he's facing this opposition from his own people, the Jews. But when I read that passage particularly, when I read that section, the first question that comes to my mind is about these 40 guys who are willing to take a vow, a promise that they will not eat or drink anything until they've killed him. Would you make that kind of vow? Would you promise not to eat or drink again until something happened? Why would you ever do something like that? Either you're so angry at Paul that you're not thinking straight. You're not keeping in mind that things aren't in your control, and something might go wrong and you can't get to him or whatever, and that would mean you can't eat anymore or you can't drink. Or you're just simply taking the oath, you're making a promise here with no real intent of ever keeping that promise. if something does come up. Well, in verses 12 and 13, we read that 40 of the Jews make an oath that they neither eat nor drink until they've killed Paul. And of course, an oath is a promise that binds you to your actions and to your word. I don't know whether these guys starved to death. You'd think if they kept their word, they would have starved to death, or they would have died of dehydration, or something of that nature. If when Paul was rescued by the Roman tribune, they all died, or as we might guess, that they really didn't keep their oath at all. They didn't keep their word. They were exaggerated words to express commitment, to make an impression, and so on, when there's not really a willingness to follow through at all. It's a foolish promise, I think, to make, and one that reveals just how easily you can say things with your mouth. You can speak words with not really having any intention to follow through. No real commitment. And I have a choice as I look at a passage like this, and I could say, well, we could really focus in on the way God delivered Paul from them. We've seen that a couple weeks in a row. I could focus on other things, but I got sort of fixated on this issue of speaking the truth about the oath taking. Although I do want to mention that Psalm 34 that we've sung 2 weeks in a row, and also focused in on verse 19, where it says that many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them from them all. This is a pretty good example of that, isn't it? By the way, that's a promise that God made in Psalm 34. And God is one who keeps his promises. When he speaks, he follows through. God's faithful to his word. Well, today's message is entitled The Believer and the Taking of Oaths. That's an exciting topic. I'm guessing that when you think of a sermon and you're maybe on Sunday afternoon waking up from your nap and you're thinking, I've got to get to church. When you hear that that's the topic, you just get in your car and you drive fast and you can't wait to get there because that's the subject you're going to be dealing with. That'll captivate your attention, I'm sure, right? Well, probably not so much, but in truth, the message today is pretty important in the fact that we're talking mostly about when we speak with our mouth, we're saying the truth. When we speak, we're going to be faithful to what we say. When we speak, we can be relied upon. When Christians talk, they don't just say things with the intent of trying to manipulate other people or deception or whatever. We do everything we can to keep our word. Christians are to be people who reflect Christ's character. And Christ, as he was teaching that Sermon on the Mount, was trying to get us to think about this. He had been addressing that culture that had become very sort of skilled in using words, in even biblical words, biblical language, and pious-sounding words to make an impression on other people, to make them think that you were pious, when in fact the words are hollow. Spoken already about their hypocrisy. Well, today we've gotten pretty good at this as well, haven't we? It's election time. And politicians are pretty good at speaking something with their mouth when in fact they have not necessarily the ability nor certainly not the intent sometimes even of following through. So sometimes we can promise things with well-intended words and not follow through. And sometimes we avoid saying the truth altogether. We just don't want to have to say the hard truth, and so we will flat out lie. Consider the following examples of how this happens. And I've just chosen a bunch of ways that this happens in society, okay? Maybe a boss is realizing that they've got to fire somebody, but they don't want to have to say to this guy, you know, call him Johnson, you're going to have to be let go. But the way we say it is, the economy is so rough, Johnson, that our company is struggling and we just have to let you go. We're so sorry. It's not about you. Well, in fact, nobody else in the company was fired except for Johnson. So the question is, what's going on there? Are we telling the truth, or is there an avoidance of having to say the hard thing? Here's another example. Maybe an advertising agent will say, we guarantee that if you come into our showroom, you're going to go home with the car of your dreams. Guarantee that. Right. Okay, well that's a meaningless promise, really. I've called a lot of health insurance people on the phone because I'm trying to get some tech support, or I've got a computer problem and I call a tech agent and I hear the words, "I'm going to put you on hold, but I'll be right back in a few seconds." Well, 95% of the time that I've ever had that experience, it's not come true. Or a contact that you've invited to something says, "You know, I couldn't make it to your Bible study this week because something in our family came up." Well, if you look into it a little bit further, you've discovered that the thing that came up was that there was a Collingwood Richmond game. We didn't want to say the truth. We didn't want to say what was actually the case. So we make up this other story to make it feel better. Or maybe you tell a friend, "I'll see you at 5:30 at the library." And it's 5:30 and it's 5:40 and it's 5:50 and you finally arrive at 5:50. The question is, when you spoke the words 5:30, did you mean 5:30? Or did you never intend for that to actually take place? Or a husband says, "No, dear, nobody in church will think you look silly in that hat, I promise." Well, the husband has promised something he can't know, whether people think that the hat's going to look funny. You see what I mean? We can use words carelessly. But the emphasis that Jesus gives on the Sermon on the Mount prior to this has been trying to get at something. What does righteousness look like? Particularly a righteousness that goes beyond what you're so familiar with, which is the righteousness of the Pharisees. Society of the Jews would have looked at the Pharisees as the top-notch righteous people. And Jesus is saying, you've got to surpass that. So if you follow Jesus' logic in the verses that we read, we talked about the angry thoughts of the heart of man are actually, or a woman, are condemned right along with the outward action of something as bad as murder. Or the thoughts of lust are condemned right along with the act of adultery. The thoughts, you see, lust leads to adultery, and that adultery can often end in divorce. And so he talks about divorce. He discusses divorce, and he then confronts us with the unfaithful heart, which had said something with the lip. "I promise you that I will be faithful to you in marriage." Only that faithfulness is not coming true. So it's natural that Jesus would then progress from these things right along to get to this issue of making promises, taking of an oath, the making of promises, and with the reliability being the focal issue. So in the discussion of marriage and divorce, there is an oath, but it's not being kept. And today that promise may sound something like this. You've heard it a bunch of times if you've been at weddings. "I promise that I take you as my lawfully wedded wife or husband, and to keep myself only unto you." And then we add this remarkable phrase, "till death do us part." Jesus moves our attention beyond murder to the heart of anger, right? He moves our attention from the outward act of adultery to the inward thoughts that go on even of lust. And then he moves beyond the outward taking of a promise or an oath, the making of promises, to the heart of telling the truth. So if we're going to have a righteousness that's going to surpass that of the Pharisees, it's going to have something to do with our being faithful with our speech. And again, Jesus confronts the culture which has not been used to that. They're undermining truth in their speech. And he confronts the legalists and the teachers who had, when they encountered a law that was maybe hard for them to have to face, what did they do? Well, they so often whittled it down to something that they could handle. And matters of legal observance that they could follow. So the heart of man caused the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Jesus' day to focus in on sort of the externals of the law. Basically making it, if I can do these things, then I've kept God's requirement. That's the same part in us that makes us want to redefine what truth is, so that we're okay before God. And Jesus draws this out by making a statement about making oaths. He says, "You've heard it said, do not break your oath, but keep oaths that you've made to the Lord." That sounds great. It is good. But he says, "But I tell you, do not swear at all." Now, everybody knew that they were supposed to keep their word. But the rabbis had actually been teaching the people, teaching the Jews at that time, that you should focus on the words that you're using in your promise to make it easier to keep, so that it determines how binding your oath is if you use the right words. And to this Jesus says, stop taking oaths. Just stop the way you're doing. As we consider that teaching, I want to remind you where you are today. Whether you knew it or not, you are in a Reformed Presbyterian church today. And historically, the name of this denomination is the Covenanters. The covenant is a promise. And this denomination has been known as the Covenanters historically. It came out of Scotland years ago. Another way of saying what our nickname is as a denomination is kind of the Oath Takers, if you want to say it that way. We have a little symbol that's kind of been adopted throughout history as the symbol of our denomination. It's a banner that was carried during battles against the king during these rough times in Scotland. It's called the Blue Banner, and it says on it, "For Christ's crown." That was our number one commitment, was to see Christ be acknowledged as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But beneath it, it said, "For Christ's crown and his covenant is a promise." That promise, actually, not just Christ's covenant, but the covenant that is being made by the people in response to that. And that originally referred to the Scottish League in Covenant. You can look it up in history and see what that's about. But what the people of Scotland were doing was promising that they were going to be allegiance was first and foremost going to go to Christ, who is the King. But secondly, they would give their allegiance as far as the king would follow, the earthly king would follow Christ, that they would follow him. They would be serving the government authorities as much as they could. Now, why is an oath like that? Why did they make a covenant? Why did they have an historic document like that? Why didn't they just say, I'm going to be a good and faithful citizen of Scotland, in submission to King Charles, or whoever it was at the time, as he serves Christ? Why did they have to go on and say, I promise this before God? I swear an oath that I will do that. Why is that necessary? Let me consider, first of all, the nature of an oath. The nature of an oath will be on our outline here. Why is an oath needed? Well, I used to have a tennis coach when I was in college. That tennis coach was also a Bible professor, and that Bible professor went on to be a seminary professor, and he's written a commentary. And in that commentary, he talks about oaths, but he says, oaths are a convention designed to restrain lies and restrain false promises. In other words, we add an oath or a promise when it's necessary to add credibility to our word. And the idea is that invoking God's name and promising to do something, we are now held accountable more for what we've said, to follow through. But that's kind of odd, isn't it? Because God heard our words the first time, right? Without us promising to do so. We said we were going to do something. He heard that. So we're still accountable to him. And then secondly, because if we're not trustworthy in what we said the first time, why is adding a few more words going to make it more trustworthy? Let me see if I can help explain why oaths are good. Your picture the situation. You've got a mom and a dad, and they call their kids into the living room. And they sit them down and they say, we have an announcement for you. We have good news. We've decided to fly the whole family to Hawaii for a vacation for a week. In the first scenario that I want you to think about, you've got the kids jumping up and down in elation. Oh, they've made this statement that we're going to go to Hawaii, and they're thrilled. In scenario 2, the kids look at each other and they go, and then they look at the parents and they say, you promise? You promise that you're going to tell me that we're really going? Now, what makes the difference there? What does the request for a promise reveal? It reveals that what has been said by mom and dad in other situations has not always been reliable. We need a little more confirmation. Can you promise that that's the case? So this makes the point. An oath or a promise is necessary when the reliability of the speaker might be in question, or it needs to be doubly confirmed, which can be true either because maybe you don't know about the reliability of someone, or because you simply aren't familiar with them, or you've had a history where it was a little doubtful. Promises and oaths exist in our society for the same kinds of reasons that we have judges in our society, lawyers in our society. It's because people break the law. And now we have to establish a keeping of the law. It's often to the courtroom that our minds turn when you think about making an oath, right? Why are promises and oaths necessary in our day? Well, it's because people are often less than righteous in their use of words. And I want some confirmation that you're now going to tell me, in this courtroom situation, tell me the truth. What is for contrasting a righteous person and the unrighteous, what does the typical unrighteous person do with words? Well, what you see that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law did is similar to what we see sometimes happening around us. And that's what Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is doing. It's lost none of the relevance for us in 2,000 years. It talks to our situation well. In the redefinition of the law, in order to make it more manageable, the Pharisees had declared that oaths were progressively binding depending on what you swore by. So, for example, we have this kind of thing happening in our day as well. How about this next little portion of the slide where you talk about the way we increase this. The lowest level of promise is, I'm going to swear it. I swear this is going to happen. But sometimes little girls will say, I'm going to make it more serious. I pinky swear it. You ever heard that? Somewhere it's out there. There it is. The first one is I swear it. The second one is I pinky swear it. And then if you want to get really, really serious, I cross my heart and I hope to die if I don't keep my word. That's how serious you can get. So you're progressive. And guys have a parallel to this. Guys have this, I dare you to do it. I double dare you to do it. Or I double dog dare you to do it. That's how bad it is. You just have ways of increasing the language. So this is actually what the Jews were doing when they were promising. If you swore something and you swore it by Jerusalem, that was pretty serious. But if you want to really get serious about your promise, you swore toward Jerusalem. But that, theoretically at least, is what they said was going to make it more serious. Or if you promise I promise this on the temple. Wow, okay, you must be serious. But if you promise on the gold of the temple, that was even more serious. Now the skill was to use words that were intentionally designed to sound serious, but kind of gave you a loophole to get out of it. Whenever you knew you wanted to be deceptive, you would alter how you swore in order to convince others, yet somehow still avoid the legal breaking of that before God. Well, this reveals man's heart. What's he doing? Misconception that somehow God is more interested in the legal outwardness of a promise than he is what's going on in here. And yet it's funny, isn't it, that God says, I don't look at the outward appearance, I look at the heart. Oaths were a big deal in Jewish society. And you can tell by verses 34 in Matthew 5 and following that people were swearing oaths by things like, I swear by heaven, or I swear by the throne, or I swear by Jerusalem, or I swear by my own head. It goes on and on. Into this environment, Jesus gives a commentary on the original intent of the law, and that spells out the proper relationship between the Christian and speaking an oath. So I want to look at that right now, the Christian oath. And since oaths have lost their significance in a society so filled with lies and deception, Jesus says, do not swear at all. Do not swear an oath at all. Instead, the heart of the matter is that your word must be reliable. Whenever it's spoken, if you're a Christian, you'll do this. The need for the oath will suddenly disappear if when you say something, you do it. You as a Christian carry something as a message which is often communicated in words, which is the most important message the earth has. No, what is that message? We carry a message that will bring justice, that will be served for all the wrongs done in society, and redemption for a fallen world, which includes all the wrongs that are present within our own hearts. We carry the truth of the gift of eternal life that God gives, the forgiveness of our sins, of joy forever, and a right relationship with our Creator. So, how important is it that we speak the truth when we're normally sharing words, so that that latter message has credibility when it's spoken? But what does the passage mean that Christians aren't to take oaths? Are the Covenanters, for example, wrong in what they did throughout history? Or is it still appropriate at times? Well, one factor that makes us ask the question is that clearly in the Old and New Testaments, We have countless examples of believers making promises. Believers taking oaths or covenants. And what's more, God himself is one who does covenants all the time. God is a covenanting God and repeatedly called Israel into covenant with him. Hebrews chapter 6 verse 17 makes it clear that God confirmed his promises to Israel with an oath. Now, I said earlier that oaths are a convention designed to restrain lies and false promises, but oaths are also a means of communicating sincerity and trustworthiness to those with whom we have not yet developed that relationship of trust. And God made a covenant with us. He entered into that covenant with those who had not yet fully learned to trust in him. Lawful Christian oaths also fit into that category. And typically we draw an important distinction between sort of private speech, public speech as well. In other words, in private speech, there's not much need to be making oaths or promises of that nature. Under those circumstances, your yes should be yes, your no should be no. But in public speech, often we encounter people with whom we don't have that established relationship. Be it in a courtroom, you don't know me from Adam, but I'm going to testify today, and so I promise you before God that I will speak the truth. Or as you're entering the military, for example. And a lot of people join the military, they often take an allegiance oath of some kind, or maybe you're taking a position as a politician or something of that nature. You stand before those with whom you don't really know very well, so you give, it requires an oath of allegiance. Well, the oath may be necessary because we live in a fallen world. But typically, as people get to know us, our words should be viewed by those in the world as simply reliable. Right? Our goal should be that no oaths are really necessary. We say that what we mean, and we follow through even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts, even when it means our personal loss, as Psalm 15 verse 4 says. That's what the Christian does. People have to be able to trust us. So very briefly, why is that so hard for us? Why is that hard? What are the temptations to fudge the truth? To deceive, or to twist words, or to tear out, or what is it that we have to tear out or cut out in order that our righteousness is going to be better than the Pharisees? What are the reasons why we don't always speak the truth? I'll give you a couple of them. And they come in various shapes and sizes, but I'm going to list a couple of them, and I want to simply say to you, you may not struggle with all these in an equal way. You may have no trouble with certain aspects. I think another one is a bit more of a trouble for you. And so I ask that the ones that are relevant to you, you ask the Holy Spirit to help you change. So here's one reason we often twist our words, and that is we have ultimately a desire to please others. A shallow kind of desire that says, you're important and I want your favor, so I'm going to say this in a way that will make you happy. We use words of flattery, for example, said in order that others might be pleased with us. And those words are pretty cheap. But because they're spoken, they're not always seen to be cheap. Another possibility is the category of words that are quickly spoken so that others will think we're reliable and that we will follow through when in fact we really haven't thought through very much the fact that our own hearts aren't going to promise that. Like these 40 Jews that promised to kill Paul. We speak quickly in the moment after having counted the cost, not very much. Or we haven't even intended to ever pay the cost of keeping our word name. And this is followed closely by a second thing that we do sometimes, and that's we try to manipulate others with our words. We use words to get from others what we want. We promise things so that they will do certain things. You go to Big W and you watch parents in line, sometimes they'll promise their children the world if they will just stop touching the candy or whatever it is. They'll promise them the world. Is there really an intent to give them that? We get a window into our motivations when we catch ourselves making promises to certain people and going out of our way. Because these are people of influence, these are people of power. When we make a promise to them, we go out of our way to be faithful to that promise. But someone who's powerless or somebody who doesn't have much influence, when we make them a promise, we're not always as careful about that. A thing careless with our words is when we use them as a device to escape having to say the hard truth. Something that necessarily needs to be said, but it's maybe unpleasant or hard to say. The example is given of that man who used words to imply that another was fired because of the economy. Well, he said that to avoid having to say to the man, you know, you're not doing a very good job. You're not being very consistent in your job. You wonder if somebody had said, your work is subpar, and said that truth to him earlier, if he'd still have his job now. An honest word's been spoken. Another example, maybe be a parent who makes all kinds of empty promises to the naughty child if he or she will behave, rather than confronting that child, exercising a proper loving discipline to that child. So that's another way. The fourth reason that we're not, maybe not always true to our promises is really just folly. We have made careless words or promises. We fail to anticipate, foresee things which are obstacles that may come that are unforeseeable. When you're speaking, we need to be realistic about what we're promising. This is really true for parents as they're talking to their children. But it's true from a friend to a friend, it's true from an employee to employer, and vice versa. When we say we're going to do something, and we promise that we'll do it, we better be sure that we are able to do so. This means being slow to promise when there are factors that you can't control, and that could change on you. That's what these 40 guys did. Their circumstances changed. They didn't have the ability to do what they had promised. That was folly. That was folly to make that promise. You know, I use an example of a dad maybe who would say to his kids, if you'll clean up the back brush and stack the wood in the back, I will take you out for gelato next week. And then he gets busy during that week, and his work requires him to be up late until the kids have to go to bed and so on, and he just is not able to follow through with his words. Promises that have to do with the future ought only to be made in the light of God's prerogative to change that future. Indeed, Jesus' counsel not to promise at all is probably the best bet right there, right? Instead of saying, you know, I promise to take you to Sorrento next weekend, since you don't know all the circumstances, maybe it would be better to say, you know, if all goes well, I hope to take you to Sorrento next weekend. If all goes well, it's that simple. Or if you say, instead of saying, I promise that we're going to go to New Zealand next year, COVID should tell us you can't always do those kinds of things, right? Certainly don't say, oh, I won't eat and drink until I take you to New Zealand. That's a bad idea, if COVID's around. Maybe you can say, you know, we can't go this year, but it's my desire, it's my great desire to take you next year. That's my plan. Well, you may remember in our Bible study, we went through James, and James chapter 4 said that, didn't it? It said, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we're going to go to this city or go to this city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Right? Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, then we will live and do this or that. As it is, your boasting is evil. It's evil because it's careless use of words that results in not being able to keep your word. It makes you unreliable. It makes you untrustworthy. And the last one I hesitate to even mention. There's probably a lot more than just these five, but I'm mentioning this last one. It's one I tend to struggle with myself more than I do some of the others. And that is, sometimes we exaggerate the truth. We exaggerate how bad a situation is, or how great the complication was and that you've overcome or something, because it's an impressive story, it's a great story. We exaggerate how great our accomplishments are in order to get praise or acclaim from others. To exaggerate how good or how bad something is to undervalue the truth. Think about it. What are we doing? The goal of exaggeration is to mislead into thinking something that is not actually true. Again, the person whose heart is becoming more and more righteous is going to describe events without distortion, without the theatrics, without the embellishments, without exaggerations. They're going to try to speak the truth and speak it in love. I'm going to wrap this up. So remember something else that James said. James said, no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. That's true, that you and I are not able to control our own tongues, and we need help. And that's what the Holy Spirit does with a believer. One of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. Learning how to control our own speech. So let us labor in this, asking that we may be able to become those people whose yes means yes and our no means no, and we don't need to go beyond that. As we serve the one who has loved us so much that he gave his life for us. Right? We serve Christ. That's what we're doing. So maybe the Lord help us in this practice.